Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Chris Clow, editor of Reverse Mortgage Daily, to talk about the CFPB's complaint database and why we're seeing an uptick in the number of complaints about reverse mortgages. Also, how seniors are feeling about their desire to either sell their homes or get a reverse mortgage as we head into a likely recession. Chris, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Sarah. Always appreciate the chance to talk to you.
And always love having you on. So let's start today talking about some of the news from the reverse space. You report on things for HousingWire. You also are the editor at Reverse Mortgage Daily. And so you have a foot in both worlds and you get to see it. But I really wanted to start with your story about the CFPB and seeing a sharp increase in complaints for reverse mortgages, which is a change. So tell us what they found.
Yeah, so this came from the 2022 Consumer Response Annual Report, which was actually published back in March, but the CFPB decided to highlight its findings again this week. And the reverse mortgage complaints certainly stood out just because, generally speaking, when you look at the report and the highlight that it put out for overall mortgage industry complaints, they actually went down when compared to the entirety of the industry, but reverse mortgage complaints went up. The monthly average for reverse mortgage complaints increased by 33% compared to the monthly average for the prior 2 years. And that's a pretty sizable increase. And most of the complaints, according to the report, were based on consumers expressing frustration about getting statements or a payoff amount from their lender, or they said that they're having difficulties making a payment or paying off a mortgage. And another interesting component of it is that when CFPB shares complaints with a company, the company has the opportunity to respond directly on the record, on the public record, I should say, or privately to the person who has made the complaint. And virtually all of the reverse mortgage complaints closed with a comment from the impacted company, which is not particularly common when you look at the full spectrum of reverse mortgage or of general complaints that are sent to the CFPB. So to get some additional perspective on what this could mean, I reached out to a friend of RMD and a longtime reverse mortgage industry educator, Dan Holtquist, who's the author of a reference book called Understanding Reverse. That was one of the books that really helped me get up to speed with the industry when I started covering the space. And he said that, yeah, it stood out to him that a lot of these issues seem to be focused on the servicing side, but it's also not too surprising to him considering all of the changes in posture that the industry has seen over the past year, particularly when it comes to servicing. The most pronounced of which being the changeover of the HECM servicing contract from HUD for loans that are assigned to the secretary from the previous holder, which was called Novad Management Consulting, to the current holder, which is C-Link, which is a very well-known entity in reverse mortgage servicing. At the recent industry conference, there were actually people who were thanking FHA representatives for awarding C-Link with the servicing contract, which I found interesting. So to Dan, it stood out that the issues are related to servicing when there's been a pretty disruptive transition, not to mention the fact that we're also coming out of a highly disruptive pandemic that impacted the mortgage industry broadly, and it certainly impacted reverse specifically. But he also did note as well that, yeah, a lot of these complaints on the reverse side are closing with comments, and that indicates to him that the industry is doing what it can to address the concerns of borrowers, particularly because it's a highly regulated part of the mortgage industry.
I think it's interesting because when you see a headline about complaints about reverse, my first reaction was like, oh my gosh, what are those complaints going to be? Or is it about the product itself? Was it, deceptively sold? So when you think about it's just the mechanics of making payments and servicing, not that those aren't important, but I do think that that's important to talk about, that it doesn't seem to be the complaints are like, there was some predatory situation or, something about the product itself, which we know has been reformed for years, but still maybe carries that stigma.
Yeah, that stigma really does stem from loans that were primarily originated during the financial crisis about 13, 14 years ago. And in a lot of ways, the industry is still dealing with some of those loans, but a lot of them have worked their way out of the system. And like you mentioned, I mean, the program has gone through so many different policy changes and has done quite a bit to try and reform itself, that it should be at least a little encouraging that those complaints are not focused on product features. Most of the time when you see like customer satisfaction data that is sent out at least by the lenders and sometimes by FHA and HUD is generally pretty high with a reverse mortgage. I mean, there are some people where that doesn't apply, and maybe some people took out the loan that maybe weren't going to use it in the way that it's probably best used for. But by and large, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that there are some issues that maybe still need to be worked out as we're still trying to find where the dust is going to settle on the servicing side after the pandemic in particular, and of course with the changeover of the contract.
So, you mentioned the reverse mortgage conference that you just went to. Give us some more information about that and how are reverse mortgage lenders feeling in this environment, right? We know that volume is down for everybody, but what was the mood like and what were some of the conversations?
Yeah, a lot of these conversations, and I think I mentioned this before, is just that reverse mortgage professionals as a cohort are extremely optimistic. You know, they're kind of gluttons for punishment. You could beat them down and it doesn't matter. They're just going to get back up and they're going to continue advocating for the product and its features. Over the past few weeks since the conference took place, I've reached out to a few different types of people who are involved in the space. I reached out to originators, I reached out to vendors, and then most recently, I reached out to executives. And in the executive conversation, I felt like the tenor that I was getting from them was that they were still optimistic. There were conversations that they had on site that seemed to indicate that maybe the business was turning a corner from some of the more recent difficulties. But it is optimism that is tempered by understanding the realities that are facing the business right now, particularly as it pertains to liquidity. That was something that was a common topic of conversation on the floor of the conference. So a few of the leaders I spoke to, one of whom is the co-chair of NERMLA itself, and he described his name is Scott Norman. Normally, he works at Finance of America Reverse, but he's also NERMLA co-chair along with Mike Kent of Liberty Reverse Mortgage, and he called it the most engaged conference he's seen since before the pandemic. And his primary takeaway was that there was unfiltered optimism that a lot of the attendees seemed to have for the second half of the year. The first half of the year has seen some pretty notable headwinds, which he does address in his statement to me. But one of the things that was kind of a key uh, indicator for him was just in looking at attendance figures from last year and this year. This year, NERMLA has taken a little bit of a different approach in terms of how it's organizing its events. In previous years, regional conferences have been 2-day affairs. They shortened them to 1 day this year to try and keep the costs in mind that attendees would incur, since no one's really rolling in cash in the mortgage business at the moment. So that transition, I think a lot of the attendees found that to be a positive recognition of sort of the circumstances of the business right now. Maybe that fed into some of the optimism that they were feeling. But either way, from the NERMLA co-chair's perspective, people were very dialed in to the programming. NERMLA oriented more of its programming around like sales and marketing strategies, which is absolutely top of mind for originators at the moment. But you also had officials from FHA who were giving an update on the program and maybe some indications about some policies that could be coming down the pike, which I've reported on RMD. So other leaders were a little more tempered in their optimism. I talked to Jesse Allen, who's the president of the 55 plus lending division at OneTrust Home Loans. And he said that, yeah, it's hard to tamp down the optimism too much, but we also have to recognize the realities that are taking place in the industry at the moment. And it's totally understandable. So generally, the conversations that I had were relatively similar. People were pretty open in their optimism, but some of them also recognize that maybe they were caught up in the moment being among their peers again. Maybe that's artificially inflated optimism, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's fake per se. It just means that, well, if you get a group of reverse mortgage industry professionals together in one room, they're going to trade notes, they're going to trade war stories, as one professional told me, and hopefully learn from each other to continue pushing the business forward.
Yeah, I mean, we've noted here before that like the people who are at the conference are already, it's sort of a biased sample because the people who are at the conference are the people doing well enough to be at the conference and find that, that's helpful to them. But still, I think it's interesting. You've noted over the last year how the reverse space does feel differently. They feel like, for instance, mortgage rates going up so fast, so quick. They just feel that differently. It has a different effect on them, even though it affects everyone, forward and reverse. I think it affects more reverse differently.
Yeah, I would think that that is absolutely the case. I mean, considering the headwinds on the reputational side, which you've already mentioned, the particularly long-term professionals in the reverse space kind of seem to have the attitude that they've seen all this before. Like they're not strangers to pressure on the business and pressure to potentially perform at a higher level. But you also have an overwhelming majority of professionals, at least in my experience, that aren't going to let that get in the way of providing guidance to their senior borrowers uh, regarding what is most appropriate for them. So there were trainers during the conference, for instance, who talked about the idea that, yeah, maybe a loan would have been beneficial for me, but it wasn't right for the borrower, so we're not gonna push that. And that is something that in a previous era of the business, the industry became known for, whether rightfully or wrongfully, that was a component of the reputation that was picked up. But you have conversations with reverse mortgage professionals today, particularly at some of the industry's biggest players, and it's all about the welfare of the client first, regardless of what the most uh, if a reverse mortgage is not going to fit for them, then in some cases you have these delineated policies from the lenders that say, client first. But in a lot of cases, it doesn't seem like you necessarily need that, because so many long haul reverse mortgage professionals kind of have that ingrained into the way that they conduct business. At least that's what I've found.
It's so true. And, again, in reverse, people don't go in and out of that industry maybe as much as they do on the forward side because, I mean, it's a longer tail anyway, just as, learning it, executing, really, creating those relationships. And so I think that's interesting. The other thing that I really wanted to point out was you've had several stories recently about how seniors are feeling and how that affects, when they want to retire, when they want to stop working, when they want to potentially get a reverse mortgage. And I think that this is so different than, in the forward space, you can talk about consumers. That's just such a wide, consumer sentiment is important, but how much more focused it is when we can look just at seniors. And so you had one that said, a story that said more seniors concerned about recession moved to sell their homes. And of course, we know there was this whole big silver tsunami idea that has been talked about for a decade that hasn't really happened. But it's interesting now to think that in a recession, they're looking to sell their homes, not get a reverse mortgage. Is that what that study found?
Pretty much. I mean, a lot of this just stems from the fact that during the pandemic, home values exploded. And statistically speaking, seniors are more likely to have higher amounts of equity because conceivably they've been paying into their mortgages for a lot longer than younger homeowners have. So it just might seem like making a home sale and potentially downsizing or right sizing, depending on the term that you prefer, could create a potential windfall for them to finance their retirements. Downsizing has often been seen as sort of a competing notion to the idea of a reverse mortgage, but at the same time, what the reverse mortgage industry counts on in most cases is that people have deeply ingrained emotional attachments to their homes, and maybe they don't want to leave them. So this is an industry that potentially provides an opportunity for them to stay without selling, but still managing to tap into that equity. But because there have been such massive increases in home price appreciation, and because you have so many seniors who are almost entirely reliant on Social Security and don't even consider tapping their home equity. If they're house rich and cash poor, so to speak, then selling might seem to make more sense to them if they're not aware of other options. And this goes back to a long-standing issue that the reverse mortgage industry has had in terms of borrower education. If there's any predominant idea that the industry at large seems to want to push forward on a constantly regular basis every year, it's expanding education. Like it's almost entirely at the top of the list every year. You could have industry exits, you could have bankruptcies like we've just seen, you could have giant M&A deals that might change the landscape of where the lenders are. But in spite of all of that, or despite all of that, a common refrain from reverse mortgage professionals is we need to expand education. And I think that survey kind of emphasizes why so many originators feel that way. It looks like retirement savings is beginning to improve, at least based on that survey that you referenced, which was conducted by Retirement Living and that we reported on back on Tuesday of this week, I believe. But it's just a lot of this too is underpinned by the idea that a lot of people seem to believe that there is a recession coming. Seems like economists are a little bit split on whether or not that's the case. It seems like the labor market and certainly the consumer spending has been more resilient than a lot of economists have expected over the past year and a half. But that concern is really driving a lot of additional interest in potentially selling their homes for seniors, I mean. And that could be a competing factor with reverse mortgages, but it just gets back to the idea of making these other kinds of equity tapping options available and more widely known within the cohort that it's designed to serve. So there's a lot of different elements that play into the conversation, but it definitely seemed to me like highlighting that study for the reverse mortgage industry audience was a good idea because of all of the competing economic priorities that seniors seem to have right now.
Well, and when you think about, yeah, they have great home equity, but if they sell and take that, where are they going? They're
Right.
going to be, buying into a higher rate environment, and other houses have also appreciated, right? So home prices are up from when they bought, and then it's not like renting's cheap, and in some of these areas, renting. So that's why I think reverse mortgages can be a great option for people that they don't even think about. It also keeps them right where they like to be. So.
Yeah, and I what you mentioned about the appreciation of other homes, I think absolutely plays into things. Just because even if you do sell your home and take the cash, you're not going to be able to get quite as much house for the same amount of money as you were a few years ago. So how does that play into the downsizing or right sizing conversation? You might not find that the home that you would like to spend the rest of your life in is achievable based on the amount of money that you might have set aside or tried to devote to finding a new home. So I think that's definitely something that the reverse mortgage industry can make a case on. Whether or not they will is another matter. Probably a whole other podcast.
A whole other podcast. Well, okay. Well, we still have plenty to talk about in this podcast. So let's go on to the forward side because we have had so much happen this week. You cover a lot of the federal action. So, the regulatory space, federal agencies, action on the forward side. And wow, we had a lot this week, which is actually interesting. We tend to see things from a news cycle speed up right before a holiday. I mean, that is just true. Like we're always on the alert, like, okay, we're going to be trying to get off early the day before the holiday, but we all know like that's when something's going to drop. That's when a lot of things happen, maybe when people aren't paying attention, but also just like us, the regulators, the agencies, they're trying to get out. So they're doing all their stuff at once. So I don't know if that's it or if they're working on this, but tell us some of the things that are going on there. We had Fannie Mae publishing FAQs for low-income refi option. We had FHA requiring a form. We had House Republicans doing something on the blocking the LLPA changes. What stood out to you?
Well, the thing, weirdly enough, I always am so dialed into when FHA makes policy changes via mortgagee letters. So even though it's objectively more interesting for probably more people that House Republicans have moved to block controversial LLPA changes, I mean, they had telegraphed that a while ago. They had hearings about that. And they even put FHFA Director Sandra Thompson on the hot seat during a House Financial Services Subcommittee hearing about why these changes were implemented. But House Republicans announced that they were going to try to block those changes legislatively a while ago, and the House moved to do that, but it's kind of up in the air whether or not that would even make it to the floor in the Senate, because as we know, the Senate has a Democratic majority and different priorities that they want to pursue legislatively. Not to mention the idea that even if a House Republican bill blocking LLPA changes did make it to the Senate floor and passed, it would very likely not be signed into law by the president. So we'll see what happens. It's quite possible that that's going to die on the vine when it comes to survival in the Senate, but we'll see. It's certainly interesting, and I think that there are some reasonable points to be made, uh, regardless of the stakeholder. Maybe it should lead to a wider conversation, but as for whether or not that's actually going to be implemented is a whole other matter. But the FHA recent mortgagee letters 2023-13, it requires the use of a form that allows borrowers to voluntarily state their language preferences and provide information on any housing counseling and home ownership education they've received. So the form, it's a Fannie Mae Freddie Mac Form 1103, known as the Supplemental Consumer Information Form, or SCIF. And it's going to be required for all FHA loan applications issued on or after August 28th. And this is really a move that has been made to try and open the door and broaden access to FHA mortgage financing to people who may not have English as their first language. So FHA has done a few things in this respect this year. They made a whole slew of additional mortgage documents and FHA documents available in different languages, and not just English and Spanish. I mean, languages down through Tagalog, that may not be widely used, but it certainly would apply to certain people who are trying to find FHA mortgage financing in some form or fashion. So opening up the accessibility of FHA financing to a wider swath of people who may not have English as their first language appears to be the priority there. And this was actually something that the National Consumer Law Center, the NCLC, applauded. They sent a statement to me saying that, since FHA is such a critical provider of financing, making sure that mortgage credit is available in often underserved communities and collecting language preferences will just only serve to expand their reach and conceivably additional access to mortgage credit. So I think that that's generally a positive development. It opens up more business to people who may not have even considered serving certain communities because of a language barrier that may have existed. Granted, FHA availability in multiple languages isn't the only issue when it comes to those kinds of barriers, but removing that barrier certainly helps, I think.
Boy, that's so interesting. Another story that really caught my eye was the fact the GSEs completed nearly 60,000 foreclosure prevention actions, and it just underlined the fact that during COVID, companies got really good at communicating with borrowers and getting them loan mods instead of them going into foreclosure. And we are now at such a small foreclosure rate. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, this came from FHFA's first quarter 2023 foreclosure prevention and refinance report that was published just last week. and initiated forbearance plans in the first quarter decreased relatively sizably. It was a little over 47,000 in the fourth quarter of 2022. Now it's just under 35,000 in the first quarter of 2023, and the total number of loans in forbearance stood at just under 66,000, which is 0.21% of the total loans serviced and 15% of delinquent loans. The serious delinquency rate also decreased to 0.6% at the end of the first quarter, compared with 4.01% for FHA loans, 2.25% for VA loans, and 1.73% for all loans on an industry average. There was a slight uptick in refinance transactions despite being down overall for the quarter. Total refi volume increased in March as rates continued to decrease through February from what was then the October peak of 6.9%. So, these kinds of reports, I think, are really critical in getting an accurate picture of the entire mortgage landscape. FHFA obviously is a provider of critical information for the industry to operate off of. And it's nice to see things moving in the right direction, but we're not out of the woods when it comes to rate volatility. I mean, I'm sure you've had conversations with Logan specifically about the idea that the highly volatile was it savagely unhealthy housing market has returned, right? Yeah, so we're certainly not out of the woods, but any information that can be provided to just provide professionals with more clarity about how things are moving is always going to be a positive development. And considering the difficulties that the mortgage industry faced out of the pandemic, particularly when it came to the need to mitigate foreclosures, I think that that's generally a positive sign. Just we're far from the end of the line here, of course.
I just think, anybody who was in the industry during the financial crisis has to just look at that and marvel at those low percentages, those low numbers, and acknowledge that, those mortgage laws that went into effect, the Dodd-Frank laws, I mean, they have made a huge difference.
Yeah.
You just don't have the kind of loans that are coming into the system that are going to crash, even if, we've had a tough year when it comes to inflation. Some people, some job loss, not a lot, but, when you look at the overall economy and the fact that there have been some pressures there, and then you look at the delinquency rate, you look at the foreclosure rate, it's just astonishingly small. And I think that that's a good thing to point out, because as we know, there are people who are always looking for the housing market to crash. And there's just no indication that that's happening.
Yeah. I mean, if in a time where the industry is looking for some good news, I think that on a longer road, looking at the evolution that the industry sort of had to go through after the financial crisis and how it's resulted in more reflexiveness on the part of regulators, certainly, and then all the lessons that were learned from the pandemic on top of that, it's certainly a disruptive time. And I'm not trying to downplay the fact that there are a lot of other issues, particularly when it comes to affordability and inventory. I mean, I've reported on inventory issues and things that are being done at the federal and at the state level to try and address those problems. But I think that you do have to try and be pragmatic and take all of the additional advancements into account in order to try and paint an accurate picture. And I mean, you want to talk about affordability? I live in the Seattle area. Affordability isn't exactly.
You are ground central for affordability problems, Chris.
Yeah, it seems that way. But on a longer timeline, I think it does benefit the industry to recognize how far things have come. That doesn't diminish the problems that are in front of everybody, but I think it does help to see, hey, if we made progress here, maybe we can make progress in these other areas too.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, thanks for being on. We'll have you again soon. Love having you on to give us the scoop on what's happening on reverse side and on the forward side. Very versatile reporter. We appreciate you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate it.